I've got two main items on my agenda for today, along with a way to get started. But so you know where we're going. I mean, today is really a chance to start looking at the material for the class in broad terms. And I had put down that I wanted you to have looked at the table of contents for the history book, which is going to provide the framework for the class in a sense. So everything else we do, if you look through the syllabus, you'll see that I've followed a chronological framework that is roughly governed by the history book. But then I've inserted various other topics as we go. So there will be sections that deal with Van der Toorn's book on scribal culture that we deal with at certain points as we go. And then there are just other themes that come up that I tried to fit in to a chronological framework, but some of which you could deal with at any point. So this is a time just to think about what that framework for the whole class is. And because it's the history book that's doing it, I'd asked you to look at the table of contents of the history book and to be prepared to talk about what kind of trade-offs that table of contents, that definition of history of ancient Israel involves. So we're going to come back to that. And then the other thing that I want to do, and I asked you to do by way of preparation, was to look at a brief section of an Egyptian text that's called the Stela of Meren Ptah. And this is a king of Egypt from the end of the 13th century. So the text is usually dated as something like 1207 BCE. And it's the first reference to Israel outside the Bible by like 350 years. And so without this reference, you can only imagine where modern historians might go in terms of talking about Israel before 850. And there would be much more room for doubting that Israel even existed. You'd have to argue it really based on the Bible alone. And with it, it doesn't mean, oh, great, we know everything the Bible says is true. But more that is, if you're grappling with what's out there and you're defining a course around ancient Israel and you want it to include this sort of earlier time, then this one text that I had you read is our basis for thinking we are not crazy, right? That Bible aside, whatever you think of the Bible aside, religiously or otherwise, you cannot write off Israel being part of the landscape of the ancient world at a pretty early point in time. And it's all based on this one text. So whatever you thought of it, this is pretty important as a starting point for the class. So that's going to be why that's the first piece of primary evidence that we'll look at together. Now, before I get to those two items, I wanted to get you thinking about categories by asking, as well as to get a little bit of a feel for the kinds of questions you might have, by asking you what you think you need in order to introduce a class on ancient Israel. Again, this is a little bit sensitive because there are some of you who think, oh yeah, I've been exposed to the Bible for a long time, whatever religious background, sometimes of one kind or another. But there are going to be a whole bunch of others of you who are much less familiar with the Bible, much less familiar with ancient Israel. And so aside from whatever I do with all this stuff, you're thinking, I don't really know much basic either. And so I want you to feel really comfortable that you belong in this class just as much as everybody else. And you'll be in a position to do just as good work as everybody else if you work seriously with the materials I give you. So for people like you as well, I mean, what do you need to know even to begin? If you try to step back and think, okay, category ancient Israel, signed up for this class. What do you need to know? I've got a set of subcategories. Somebody willing to give it a try? Don't be afraid to be obvious. Yeah.
Where is it?
Okay. So where is it? So what is that connected to? If we say where is it? If you turn that into a category, location, a technical term would be geography, right? So good question, good category. It was even on my list here. So I mean, for one, it is Well, here, and you can ask it a couple of ways. I'll partly answer the question. I didn't bring a map. It's in the same place as modern Israel, you could say in one way. But this is also a little bit of a trick, because when you ask about geography and you ask about location, one of the things you could ask is what is the relationship between modern names and old names? And this is where it gets extremely tricky when you're talking about ancient Israel. I have no problem talking about ancient Israel and Judah, but when I try to come up with a name for the meaning, what am I going to use? This is now not a fair question, maybe assumes you know a little bit of something already. But what else? Like if we say, all right, we're going to study ancient Israel, it is on the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, south of Lebanon, north of Egypt, sort of kind of the more southern, eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. And that's where it is, but what am I going to call the area? Yeah?
I was going to say, does Israel refer to people or place?
That's a good question too. Does Israel refer to people or place? Now, again, in the first class, I gave my two, at least polls of explanations for, or definitions of the term Israel. And if one of them was kind of the people of the Bible, then absolutely it's people. And it was an identity that had to be able to survive the dispersal of these people to all parts of the world. My other definition was more tied to place, if you remember, because I said that it's the people who were associated, at least most narrowly, with the people and kingdom called Israel that existed at least from 1200, and this is based on the text we're going to look at today, down to a little before 700 when the kingdom of Israel was destroyed. And from that point of view, it would be very tied to place, even though in fact, I would still say it was the people who lived who belonged to this government, you could say. It was a group of people who acted as a whole. They could either be a kingdom or not a kingdom, but they were very much tied to the place. What else might come up in terms of geography? Yeah, go ahead.
Just how it came to be, like how that region came to be classified as Israel?
Well, this goes a little bit back to then my question I just asked before. If you ask the how it came to be question, then another way to put that is, well, what would you have called it before it was Israel? Yeah, way in the back?
Resources.
Okay, so I'm going to file that, so I'll come right back to you in a minute, because that's another category. I'm going to stick with geography for a minute, but good question. Well, but anybody have an answer to the name thing? Yeah?
Canaan.
Okay, so he said Canaan. What do I have to write with? Theory. I have this. Okay, somebody lent me a marker. Is there anybody back there who will tell me I can't use this? It works. The question is, will it erase? Not my problem, right? I'll leave and it will be gone when I come back on Wednesday, I hope. Or everyone will know, right? So in the Bible, there is actually a name for what you call it before, which is Canaan. But how do you know that's not just the Bible's kind of way of thinking about who was there before Israel? How do you know that's what they... Like if you were not from Israel and you lived there when Israel got started, whatever was going on, would you have called yourself that? How do we know that? But this is the kind of answer that I'm looking for. And it's not totally clear. This is definitely part of an answer to a question of who's there before Israel. But it's probably more complicated. But then the question is, well, how about after Israel? What should we call, is there something we can call the area? Shall we call it Palestine? Why not, or why? What is complicated with calling the area Palestine? You want to have a separate, try it? This is way in the back. Go ahead.
Political, like...
Yeah, there's a little political complication. Somebody else have some? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, wasn't it called like a bunch of different things also? Like it was called Palestine, but it was also called Transjordan, and it was British mandate of something.
So does anybody know where the name Palestine comes from? This is good, right? So, yeah, it does. Anybody ever heard of Philistines? So, they also, if you think of, again, the modern Gaza Strip, which is the sort of little part of the sort of non-Israeli part of Palestinian territory, it's one of the old Philistine centers, maybe appropriately. But This name then is really old. I mean, it goes back about as far as Israel. In fact, interestingly, the Philistines were also new to the area. They're also not Canaanite, whatever that is. They also were established a little after 1200, maybe slightly after Israel. But the interesting thing is that the actual name Palestine is Roman, and it's what the Roman Empire called. They took the old Philistine name and used it to apply to the region more broadly. So the term Palestine is old, and in a sense you could say it's pre-political. I mean, it's not that it's just a name that was given to Palestinians per se, as opposed to Israelis, as part of a question of what happens to the region. It's older than like Transjordan or names like that in a sense. But it's still complicated, right? And also it's not defined by Israel. It's something bigger. There was Syria, which was more to the north, and Palestine, more to the south. And I know also it's for our course, it's almost too late also. It's a Roman name, and it comes from the name of somebody who's not part of Israel in the earlier time. So we didn't have to pursue this farther, but you begin to get a sense, both for one, where they are, right? But the other thing to watch for is when you think of what was the name called before, and or the region rather called before, and what was the region called after, if you tried to speak of it broadly, and what other peoples were there around who are going to get tangled up with Israel and its people, and what about the notion of what happens after the kingdoms of Israel and in fact Judah, which is going to complicate things further. What happens when those fall, and yet you still have a people, especially the people of Judah, who both lay claim to the name of Israel on one hand, and who work really, really hard to maintain an identity that can outlast the loss of their land on the other side. And so, of course, I mean, there are certain clear names like Israel or Jew, which is from Judah, that can go with that identity, but then what is the relationship of that to land and place and so on, right? So this is all important as something you need to know. Back in the back, the person had suggested that it might help to know about resources. So what are you thinking about, like when you say resources?
It's like, well, also kind of has to do with geography, with like what's available to them.
Are they rich? Are they poor? How do they make a living? Okay, right? So there's all sorts of stuff like that. Simple answers, just by the by. I mean, if you can ask the questions, I'll give you. I asked what you needed to get started, right? So I'll give you a little, all right? They're not that rich. They don't have a heritage of enormous trade, though they participate in trade, especially as time goes by. But they're usually more at the kind of raw materials, low-level production end of the trading schemes. They're not a center with high-skill centers. And in general, the area of Israel was one of the poorer areas of the region. And it was, if you look at New York and I say, well, where are you from? Well, so a little bit, Israel would have been a place you were from before you went off to the big city. It's not exactly a good analogy, but people did end up going off sometimes. But just as you're trying to imagine, it's mostly farming communities based on relative poverty compared to the areas around. Yeah?
Aren't there like the 7 or whatever like main harvests in Israel, like the fig and the date and like stuff like that?
I mean, for sure. I mean, so if you ask more about what would they have grown, and I mean, a tradition of 7 harvests is later, and you'd have to kind of read it back and figure what can you tell that there's evidence for. But for sure that there would have been grain types of probably wheat and barley, and then there would have been various sorts of fruit, especially dates and grapes. And then, like you say, I mean, there could be figs or apricots or some other kind of fruit like that. And how that went, it's not as if this was a terrible life necessarily. It kind of depended on whether you had issues with pests or weather, rain. And it's not to portray them as miserable and unhappy and without resources, but that if you think, the point is actually to think where to put Israel in terms of its neighbors. And so, for instance, the Philistines, who lived right along the coast and who probably even had a heritage in the Mediterranean, and as sailors they were like the Phoenicians further north, then they tended to have higher technology, they tended to be wealthier, a lot more imports in terms of even what you find as pottery and things like that. Israel, even though modern Israel occupies the shore, it rises quickly to a pretty high ridge of hills or mountains. And so Israel was really identified primarily with that highland and then everything to the east of it, not with the coast. And that reflected that they weren't as well off. Which again, I mean, they had ups and downs in terms of how things went, but okay. What do you have?
I would think you have to also maybe know the social structure and what they looked up to. Some
Okay.
looked up to being a good warrior, but they exactly what they were going for and what kind of people they were trying to be.
Okay, so I mean, you can take the whole social structure in a lot of different ways. Certainly, I mean, they partook of what was common to everybody in terms of family life and the importance of family definitions and local clans and whatnot. But where it gets to be a bigger issue is that at least the Bible portrays Israel as having had a tribal structure connected to its origins. And this is a complicated thing to evaluate historically because all you have is what the Bible says about that. But I see this as deeply rooted in what would have been actual history, and it's not at all universal. So if you were from Babylon, or you were from Beirut, or something like that, or even if you were from Egypt, it was much more likely that you'd be identified with a city where you lived, probably with a large kingdom and its structures of power and wealth. And in Israel, it seems like the tradition was much more decentralized. And that went with not being extremely wealthy. It maybe left a lot more freedom at a local level than other parts of the ancient world that were wealthier would have had. Yeah? You want to follow up? Yeah.
I just don't know because you just said they were associated with where they lived somewhat. Is that later on? Is that different from earlier on to later on? Like later on, they were associated more where they went, where they were from, where they were, but earlier on, they were all similar in a similar place already. So they were more based on tribal, I guess. Whereas they then moved from that once they more separated, they went to where they're from.
Well, so, I mean, all I was going to say in terms of tribes was that it's a way of organizing that's defined more locally and that defines a bunch of parallel separate units instead of saying, we are Babylon, we are the kingdom of Babylon, we're defined by the city of Babylon and its temples and palace, and like Israel's not built that way. We'll talk about this some more. And okay, Aisha, I remember your name. So,
just in reading this text
yeah.
today, the words, not really knowing.
What even things mean? Words like Israel and like Judah. So for one, I mean that you can put names out here. Just what are names of things and what do they mean? Absolutely. Let me just, so I'm going to shift gears, but to give you a sense, right? So for one, nobody's actually brought this up. What about the Bible? Are you all assuming that when we're going to have a course on ancient Israel, that you know exactly how the Bible relates to this class? That the Bible is going to be our handbook for understanding the history of ancient Israel? Are we taking that for granted? And if so, on what basis? I mean, and I'm not forcing you to answer this question, but we have to answer it as a group. And anybody who approaches study of ancient Israel has to think about this because the Bible is one source. We're going to talk about it more in future classes. But the oldest manuscripts of the Bible that we have come from the region of the Dead Sea in Roman times. So the oldest manuscripts of the Bible that we have are from Roman times, which would be, maybe the 2nd, 1st century. It's clear that they're based on much earlier material. There are certain signs of texts that have to have come from at least a couple hundred years before that, but this is still long after even the last kingdom called Judah ceased to exist. So this is, again, not to come down on any particular side of a question of what in the Bible is historically accurate or not, what it knows of the past and what it does not. But it's to say that our actual biblical source as such is very late compared to the time period that it's describing. And so in effect then, the Bible has to be, it provides this huge resource in terms of evidence that has to be evaluated. We can't just assume that it knows what it's talking about in terms of society. Like the question about social structure and tribes. I had to answer it actually relying on the Bible. And you could hear me hesitate a little bit, not because I don't have strong opinions, but because it gets complicated. Because how do we evaluate this biblical tradition of the tribes of Israel going back to the beginning? And it's not as if it's a kind of eyewitness account. Oh, well, this is how we're organized, like an anthropologist going in and interviewing the locals. So one huge question for this course is, where is the role of the Bible? And how do we use it as a source for ancient Israel? And I will embrace it as a source for ancient Israel. At the same time, as we go through the class, I will put out various questions, issues that come up. And also, I will try to use the Bible as one piece of evidence. You know, if you're trying to prove anything, then the more kind of cross-cutting lines of evidence you have, then the stronger your case. If you're a lawyer, you're trying to prove a case. If you just have one witness and everything stands or falls on whether this person, number one, is telling the truth, but number two, even knows that much about the case in question, then you can try it, put the person on the stand, see if everybody believes them. But especially if it turns out that the case is actually about a murder that happened in the year 1896, and it's one of you guys who's the witnesses because your great-grandfather was there at the time, then if I was on the jury, I'd be sitting there thinking, how much did you talk to your grandfather? Right? Oh, it was great-grandfather, I forgot. So you must have gotten it through your father, or maybe you talked to your grandmother, and it was her dad. But she had a really good memory, and she took notes, right? But you see what I mean? In a way, with the Bible, you start, if this is your only evidence for any given question, then you have to be asking these kinds of questions, not critically in the sense of accusingly, but it's just it's one piece of information. And yet, in terms of names and words and stories and frameworks, the Bible provides so much that isn't anywhere else. So I don't want to leave it aside either. We're going to have to connect with it all the way through the course. Huge question for understanding what to do with ancient Israel. So in a way, this came back to the last thing I had on my list, which is about evidence. Okay, in a way, the very first question you should ask for a course in ancient Israel is, well, what's the evidence? What are we going to look at? What is there to tell us anything about ancient Israel? And that's where the Bible question that I began with comes in again, because the Bible has all sorts of things to say about ancient Israel, but actually dates in the form that we have it to a time after ancient Israel ceased to exist. So then the question is, well, what other evidence would there be? And there will be archaeological evidence that we'll talk about, some less than you might in another class because I'm not an archaeologist. But there's also evidence from other types of writing outside the Bible. And that evidence becomes crucial because that evidence comes from the actual time of Israel where we have it. And so it's a powerful voice, even though what it says is often much more limited than what the Bible might say. Okay, so put all that together with the sorts of questions you guys asked, and you can see, these are things I'm not assuming you know already. And one thing that your history book will do is it'll give you a framework for beginning to think about this stuff, the people, the society, the basic changes in history, the geography. Then really go ahead and lean on the book. It's a pretty good book. It's always difficult to figure out how to write this kind of broad introduction, but this is one of the better ones that's out there. Okay, Any last questions about this? Things to get you started. So let's take a look at this. The first thing to keep in mind with the book is that it is edited. And that may sound obvious, but I have had a lot of people write papers citing edited books as if they were written entirely by the same person. So keep in mind that every chapter in this history book was written by someone different. There are no two that were written by the same person. And even though this guy named Michael Coogan edited them and came up with a sort of vision, he's probably the one that defined the different chapters and decided what kind of history it should be, and then invited different scholars to participate. But within each chapter, the scholars have different different strengths, different things they know best. They have different points of view, and they're not all going to agree. So keep that in mind as you read. You may like some of the chapters more than others, partly just because they seem better written, better done, and it's just going to be the way a book like that is. Whereas Van der Toorn is one scholar writing a single book, and it has a unified vision. So this book, I had another page here. Remember the title? Anybody? You can check, you can cheat. What?
Oxford History of the Biblical World.
Yeah, Oxford History of the Biblical World. So what do you notice about this title? Yeah?
He's relying on the history from the Bible's point of view to tell his account. as
Okay. So,
Other artifacts.
okay, so this is interesting. You're on the... I'm not looking for a single right answer or something, but what she said was that it's relying on the Bible for the history, as opposed perhaps to other artifacts or other sorts of evidence. What you'll see when you actually use the book is that that's not true, that it's very much relying on other sources, other evidence, other artifacts, and things like that. I wrote this down somewhere, but out of the chapters that I'm going to have you read, which are more focused on the beginning and middle, at least 2 or 3 of them are written by archaeologists, people who are even primarily archaeologists. Larry Stager, who writes the chapter on the beginning of Israel, Carol Myers, who writes the chapter on Kings, and who was the third, if I remember? But anyway, so at least those 2. And Carol Redmount does the early chapter on Egypt, and the 3 of them are archaeologists. So this is interesting. You've got people who are archaeologists. They're not even biblical scholars, and they're not even necessarily people who are specialists in Israel. Carol Redmount is an Egyptologist or an archaeologist who works on Egypt. And yet the book has biblical in its title. So you're onto something, right? There's something going on with that, yeah?
Well, by biblical world, it could mean not only ancient Israel, but all sort of religions and everything all related to the Bible.
So it can mean all around. She's saying that by biblical world, it could mean, not just Israel, but the area around it, but as related to the Bible. And that's absolutely right. So then the question is, so what does that leave us with as a history? Because that is what it's doing, right? It's self-consciously defining this history around the biblical world. That's the key phrase. And it's a kind of a clever solution to a hard problem, which is, how do you even define who you're talking about? Like, what's the center, and what are you going to involve, and where are you going to draw the lines and say, I'm not going over there? So for one, you'll notice this course is not defined as, the biblical world. We could have called it that, right? It's not. It's called Ancient Israel. And yet I chose a history text that uses biblical world, partly because I just liked it better than some of the alternatives. But I chose a text that doesn't have Ancient Israel in the title. So what happens when I do this? Right? What happens in this textbook? So this is where I then asked you to look at the contents. And you'll see there were, 11 numbered chapters, a prologue and an epilogue. You pick all that up? So 13 pieces to take a look at. So if you take this apart for me, what do you see? Go ahead.
A lot of the chapters are defined by governmental eras or different changes in power.
Okay, that's a nice observation. So if the chapter, and I'll spell it out, right? So she said that a lot of the chapters are defined by kind of governments and changes in power, and that's right. I mean, it talked even at the beginning about an age of judges, I think, and then there was kinship and kingdom or something, and then there's the sort of divided monarchy, or I don't remember how they put that next phrase, and then I don't know, it goes to the end of Judah. I don't remember how that chapter is defined, but then it talks about the Persian period, or life under the Persians, or something like that, and then yeah, the Romans get into it in the later part. That's a nice observation, that just in terms of the categories, that's how it's organized. So then I suppose the question would be, well, what happens when you organize it that way? But did you want to put something else into it?
I was just gonna say, it might sound obvious, but it doesn't start like at the emergence of the King of Israel, like it starts before that.
Nope,
I mean, in
good.
any history course, you should probably know like what happened before.
Some kind of
time
background.
of whatever you're studying, but I thought it was interesting that like chapter 1 is before.
Yeah, and the prologue would have been 2. So in a way, there's kind of 2 sections that even deal with time before Israel. And I want to come back to that as well. So right off, you really have the first 2 chapters, or the prologue and the first chapter, that are completely defined without Israel involved at all. And then do you remember what the next chapter after that? Right, so you have this prologue, then you have, what's it called? Before Israel, Syria, Palestine, in the Bronze Age. Like, I want to sensitize you to names, right? So you can see somebody trying to call it something. They didn't call it Canaan, interestingly, right? So for one, that cast a kind of broader regional net than Canaan would have. But also it just avoids the term. It's a little bit unclear what that would have meant in that early time. Syria, Palestine, they go with. This is one of the archaeological conventions. But then the next one is bitter lives, Israel in and out of Egypt. So this is also not Israel. But what do you notice about this chapter?
Sure.
Yeah, somebody? Yeah, go ahead.
It talks about them moving to what is now, I guess, or what was Israel.
Okay, so it talks about them moving to, what is Israel? Go ahead.
Describes Israel as a people and how they're not, it's not based on place itself. It's just
Okay, Israel's people not based on place. That's interesting in terms of the conversation we had about geography and what they are. Yeah, go ahead.
This is obvious, but it describes a biblical event.
Yeah, it may be obvious, but that's one thing I really wanted you to hear, right, to get, right? It describes a biblical event. So again, this is not making any judgment about whether it happened or didn't happen or happened in some other form, right? But I want you to think in terms of evidence and interpretation in a way. And so if I just asked you if you had a little bit of background, tell me the story of Israel, then a lot of people might say, oh yeah, I've heard of that. There was they were in Egypt, and there was an exodus out of Egypt. And they all moved into the land, and there was Joshua and the Battle of Jericho that I mentioned last time. But all of this is the Bible's story. And so in terms of a study of ancient Israel, you have to kind of put that out there and say, well, what do we do with it? Like, what other evidence is there that could speak to the story, interact with the biblical story? And so what's interesting is that in this history book, the editor came right out and said, all right, first chapter that's actually on Israel, let's have it be on the Egypt thing. and he brings in an Egyptian archaeologist to write the chapter, and she talks, you'll see, she talks about the biblical story a bit and sort of weighs what you do with that, what we can know or not know. And people come out all over the map in terms of some people thinking it's just totally fiction, and other people think, oh, it must have happened, and a lot of people in between. But the thing that I want you to notice in terms of the definition is, if I go back to the person who said something before behind you, chapter 2 is defined by a biblical event. Chapter 1 is not. Right? So there's some kind of break there where the editor, Michael Coogan, said, if I'm going to put together history of the biblical world, I'm going to have background chapters that are not about Israel. They're not about Israel at all. They're just background, stuff I'm going to tell you about that world. With chapter 2, he switches gears. And he says, all right, Israel starts. Now we're with the Bible. And I want to come back to that. Go ahead.
I think it's also worth noting that the prologue's title starts with "in the beginning."
Okay. Yeah, you like, oh, that's a nice, did you catch that? The prologue's called In the Beginning. It's almost a Genesis. Yeah. Just in case, right. If you want, traditional translations of Genesis, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. I don't want to assume all these things. Yeah, it makes even that first chapter look like it's treating Genesis, which in a way it is. So that's actually in counterpoint with the person saying, well, it looks like just background, which is a good observation. And there is nothing about Israel in the, I'm trying to remember, there might be a little section of reflection on Genesis in that chapter 1. Yeah, in a way it's a Genesis sub. And you're right, the title of the chapter kind of picks it up. So this Bible story thing, so you followed the chapters down. How long does the book stick with the Bible story? Or anybody? So look at what you got. Either you got the book with you, or I asked you to take a look. Go ahead.
Not so long, just for 5 chapters.
Okay, so 5 chapters. I'll sort of run you through them, right? So you have the bitter lives, Israel in and out of Egypt, forging an identity, the emergence of ancient Israel. Now this is an interesting one. This is the chapter that's by Lawrence Stager, archaeologist at Harvard, who has done a lot in this time period. In a way, you could say this is biblical, and it's talking about the origins of Israel, but it's really a kind of archaeological parallel or an archaeological counterpoint to the sort of Egypt story that is in chapter 2. And he asks more, well, from an archaeologist's point of view, what does the beginning of Israel look like? And he runs through various theories about it, and it's a pretty long chapter, but really important. We'll get there. Next chapter, chapter 4, there was no king in Israel, the era of the judges. Anybody know what judges is? This is, again, a sort of unfair question, but yeah. It's a book in the Bible, yeah. So again, obvious answers are just right, what I want, right? No, it's a book in the Bible. So the way the Bible goes is it has this, again, this is a little getting ahead of myself, but we're introducing, right? So we have what's sometimes called the Pentateuch. It is equal to what in Jewish tradition, which is older, is the Torah, which are 5 books associated with a guy named Moses. And I'm not going to list them, but they start with Genesis. You can look them up in your Bible. But then after that, you have this book called Joshua, which is the Battle of Jericho book. And that's describing a kind of and it's one thing to have an exodus and get out of Egypt and the waters of the Red Sea part and everything like that, but then there they are out of Egypt. Where do you go from there? And so it's the book of Joshua that eventually takes them into the land, and they have it. They show Israel taking it over. And it's only after that the Bible brings you to this book of Judges. And it says, well, there was a time when there were no kings, and yet there was Israel. They had the land, no kings. And it's just this one book, really interesting and important book, because it's the only book of the Bible that actually describes what might be like the first half of Israel's actual life. And it's only 21 chapters long. So, yeah. So that's that chapter. Then you have chapter 5, kinship and kingship, the early monarchy. Chapter 6, there's the politics for you again. Yeah. Chapter 6, a land divided, is Judah and Israel. So there ends up being these 2 kingdoms. And then you have into the exile. So if I go back to you who were saying 5 more chapters. So so 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Is that what you're thinking maybe? Or it depends on how you count. So into the exile, that would take you through it says to the fall of Babylon. But this is after both kingdoms, Israel and Judah, are gone. And so the Bible does actually continue to address a little bit this next period of the time when the Persians were running things. But in terms of the Bible story that takes you through the book of Kings, then you're right. It goes through chapter 7. But at least then notice that the middle part of this history book is defined by the Bible storyline and kind of the big political changes. So what happens after that? There's still a few more chapters. What do you see and what do you learn from what you see with the way the book rounds out? What comes after? Go ahead, and behind the pole. Yeah.
Jews under, or I guess like Jews/Israel under the rule of different nations, basically.
Right, so you get this, so you start with Persians, and then it's what they call the Hellenistic age, but then it says, what is it, from Ptolemy to, Pompey, well, let's see, there's from Pompey to the First Jewish Revolt. Oh, they don't mention Ptolemy. Yeah, so between Alexandria and Antioch, that's what they define. But this is because in the period after the Persians and before the Romans, there was, after Alexander the Great, things were kind of divided between a center in Egypt and a center in Syria. And so Israel was, or that area was caught between the two. So you get these periods. Now, they're not defined by the Bible, per se. So this is a real switch, right? So we start with background, we move into the Bible story, we get to some point where the story kind of peters out, or at least it doesn't have a clear connection to the Bible's own sequence. Because in the Bible you get this, 5 books of Moses, Pentateuch, Torah, then you get Joshua, Judges. Now if there's an eraser, I'll find out right away. And guess what? Uh-oh, bad news. I'm in big trouble. They don't provide anything. Might as well keep writing, though, at this point, right? All right. So where do I write? Might as well just write on the wall, right? Push it up. No one will notice, right? Now I better stick in the same area now that I'm writing, right? But so really after Judges comes, all right, I'm going to do it. Samuel and Kings. Those are the ones I was talking about being split, right? So you have the 2 books of Samuel and 2 books of Kings. And that's really the Bible's main story. It takes you from Genesis, Exodus, and then other books of Moses, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. And that's the story. And it takes you down to the destruction of the people of Judah. And then there are parts of the Bible that deal with what happened after, that what happened to the Babylonians. It says Babylon eventually, and pretty quickly, lost out to the Persians. It's got a longer technical name of what you call that empire. But, by the time you get into the Persian period, then the Bible really lets it go. It considers that you're sort of out of the period of Israel at that point, or at least a biblical period. And yet the text keeps going. And instead of following the Bible, divides it by these kind of imperial stages or ages. So it takes you through all of those to the Romans in chapter 10. And then it gives you chapter 11, churches in context, the Jesus movement in the Roman world. And then has an epilogue, transitions, and trajectories, Jews and Christians in the Roman Empire. So you look at these last few chapters. What do you learn about how he's conceiving of his project, the Oxford History of the Biblical World? Go for the obvious. Yeah, go ahead.
He's talking about the religions that come out of the region.
Okay, talking about the religions that come out of the region. Good start. What else do you notice? Anybody? The purple plus.
It's also following like the Christian Bible, it's like covering like the whole.
Yeah, so this is interesting. That there's a weird thing about this book, because on one hand, it's dominated by, when it says biblical world, and in fact, this guy is a sort of archaeologist and biblical historian, but in the sense of ancient Israel, he's not a sort of New Testament person, and yet the way he's defined the book, he's carved out a place for the New Testament in it. And in a way, he's kind of drawn the finish line after the New Testament, which colors it in a certain way, right? I mean, that's the last full chapter, is to at least put that, is to locate the New Testament in it, even though the book is quite clearly not about the New Testament. And those last chapters are not about, they're not aimed at Christianity per se, they're really about early Judaism, and the scholars who are writing those chapters are experts in early Judaism. So notice those things then, that there's a way in which Christianity draws the line underneath the end of his biblical world. And so even though he's defined this more around Israel, which is why it's a good book for this class, there's a funny way in which the Bible he's thinking of is a Christian Bible and includes the New Testament along with an Old Testament. And so for him, that provides a pretty natural, sensible endpoint, especially because in at least Christian contexts of various types, if you had a course that was on biblical history or something like that, it would include that period up to then, and you can say, all right, there's your end. But what if you're not working it that way, either because you're Jewish or because, I don't know, you're just not working in a Christian context? How do you know when Israel comes to an end? So that you can, or at least ancient Israel, so you can stop talking about it and talk about something else. And I mean, I could try to pull out answers for it from you, but in a way, there's no single answer. You can see various points of transition, but you could, especially if you go with my more religious definition of Israel from the first class, where I said that if it's the people of the Bible, and then those people, that name from the Bible is adopted as at least a sort of co-name for the Jewish people. And the Jewish people, there are these identities that get picked up. There's just being Jewish, which Yehudi, you just can also keep writing, right? It's like one of those jokes that keeps coming back every time I say anything and write it. But this is just directly from the Hebrew word for Judah. So the identity of being Jewish comes directly from the southern kingdom, the southern people of Judah, the last kingdom standing of the two. And the name Israel is associated with the other kingdom, actually, the more northern one when there were two. And in the end, the Jewish people end up saying, oh, that name's ours too. So you get these two identities. And then there's this term Hebrew, which I won't write, Hebrew, Hebrew, which is a kind of rare biblical word that has a very particular usage, but that in somewhat later time comes to be treated as a kind of ethnic identity. But that really it's also another name for being Jewish. And yet none of these identities has a kind of sharp line that says, okay, now we're out of the ancient and we have moved into something else. So the way I've defined the course is more around the Israel. When I say ancient Israel, I'm meaning the people that existed as a distinct people in the land. And so, yeah, I'll give you some background. Yes, I'll give you some follow through for what happens as all of this comes to an end. But I'm defining the course around the establishment of a people called Israel in this land that's at the southeast end of the Mediterranean, and then walking through a time when they had no kings, whatever was going on in their first stages that are so hard to know how to evaluate because we have a biblical story and archaeology and they're hard to connect. But then we get to a period where they're said to have had kings, and at a certain point in the 9th century, 800s, we start to get bits of evidence from outside the Bible that even name these people, Israel for one. But the funny thing is that by that point, we have two kingdoms. We have Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And so absolutely, that's part of my ancient Israel. And the first kingdom, the kingdom of Israel that has the older name, is destroyed by the Assyrians in about 720, 722, 720. And that leaves Judah, the southern one, which was servant of the kingdom of Assyria until it finally bit the dust in the early years after 600, so counting backwards, the early 6th century. Finally, in 586, Jerusalem is leveled because the Babylonians figured that they'd keep rebelling if they didn't wipe it out. So in some ways, 586 marks the end of Israel as an independent people in the land. From that point on, there might be people from Israel, people from Judah living there, along with living in all sorts of other places. But there is never again, until modern Israel, going to be an independent people living in that space. And so I'm defining ancient Israel around that people, which I think the Bible does also, interestingly. That if you think, well, why does the Bible kind of close shop when it does? It keeps talking about these people afterward, but it's more to say, well, you want to know what happened to them after Judah ceased to be as a kingdom. And it tries to help you get a sense of where they went, what's going on. But with this equal sense that they're not trying to tell you the history of the Jews under the Persians. Okay, so notice these things about the book. And the biggest thing, I guess, to recognize is that in some ways, Coogan solved the problem of ancient Israel by saying, all right, I don't see clear boundaries for how to talk about ancient Israel, so I'm going to talk about Israel in the biblical world. And it's easier to draw boundaries around that because we know where the Bible's own boundaries are. And so it's a clever solution. But the one thing I want you to notice about it is that it's a choice that makes the biblical story central. So that as Coogan's book walks you through these different phases, it embraces the Bible story, and it goes ahead and lets you think in terms of the categories of the Bible story. I could tell you, wait, what if those categories are all wrong? Let's go to archaeology. We'll talk about the Iron Age 1 and the Iron Age 2, and we'll break those down into subcategories, and we'll talk about phases of changes in population, and that would be really legitimate. One problem with it is that the archaeology doesn't come with a lot of non-biblical text to say, all right, we know who's here at this time and what they're called, and we know how they're organized, and if they had kings or not, and what they were called. The only way we get those names through most of history, all of our history of ancient Israel, is from the Bible. So you can see why I want to use the Bible. It at least tells us some possible names for things and what's going on. So I've accepted Coogan's choice of working with the biblical world, partly because I just think the book is useful and has some well-written chapters. But at the same time, I want you to be aware as we go along that the book has been shaped by the Bible's story in a way that I want you not to take for granted. I want you to be very cautious as we move through each step, just to, again, I mean, not a question of what you believe or anything like that so much as recognizing evidence and argument, what you know and based on what. And there may be places where you say, okay, I can see this story, this whole period, this way of looking at things is only from the Bible. Therefore, I'm sure it's true. Or therefore, I'm sure it's a fairy tale, right? Depending on your personal views of such things. But I mean, I hope what you'll come out of the class with is a sense that, the fairy tale argument is probably, and there's a lot in the Bible that you just can't write off that way. The sort of total unquestioning belief is also, I mean, it becomes hard to hold in some sort of really rigid form at least. And so I'm hoping all of you will just struggle with this stuff and come out with your own personal answers. But again, being aware of when the Bible's shaping your views and when, it's at least working in tandem with a bunch of other stuff or certain ideas are just not coming from the Bible at all, and you see where the other evidence would be. So let's move to Maren Ptah. Mari, can you help? So throughout, I'm using Mari's computer for our readings. But Mari, from her sections last year or something, had come up with a couple of pictures too. So. Yeah, for the last 15, 20 minutes then, I want to take a look at this one non-biblical piece of evidence. And again, I don't know how you react to this. At least, I don't even remember when I first heard about this text, but it wasn't until I was an early graduate student probably. I didn't have any of this in my background. Just go ahead and start. Yeah, or try. For me, this is a shot out of the blue, right? Like, whoa, where did this come from? That there would be some reference to Israel in an Egyptian text. Either that it was there or that it was so rare. I would just have had no clue. So, you'll see, it's pretty short. It's not all that thrilling as a work of literature. But if you follow up, it's coming, I think. If you follow up this notion that I want you to be conscious of where the story is being framed by the Bible and where not, then this is a place just to get an independent footing, where you can think, all right, let's just set the Bible, we'll come back to the Bible, we'll set it aside, and ask, so you know what?
Can you see that?
This is not Merneptah. But that one is. Yeah, the other one was Merenta, or was, Mesha. When we get to what's the next non-biblical evidence, save that slide because... So the other one was this text from the 9th century in ancient Moab that also mentions Israel. But, okay, so this is this nice, you have somebody there for size, right? So when you imagine this text, right, so you've got this big monument, and then there's a little, I don't know if you can read where it says Israel is, but you could tell from your text that it was at the end, right? It was just in this little subsection at the end. And so here would be then a translation of that section only at the end, which is really what we want to focus on. It's important to realize that the text as a whole, this is a king of Egypt, and his name used to be read as Merneptah. It has 3 signs, I think, and Ptah is an Egyptian god, and I don't know Egyptian. So, but the Mer they left the same. I don't know if it's sun or something like that, and then the middle sign was what got reread. But apparently the Egyptologists agree, so I'm going to read it as Meren Ptah. So that said, I mean it's mostly about this campaign against the Libyans. So which would have been people who were, just like modern Libya, to the west of Egypt, going out across Africa, not in the direction of Israel. But at the very end, they tack on these lines. And there you go. The princes are prostrate, saying, mercy. Not one raises his head among the 9 bows, which is a kind of category for, like, I don't know if it's the sort of, somebody help me if you know. There's a set of 9 gods that are at the sort of center of primordial Egypt. I'm going to get out of my depth. Desolation is for Tehenu. Hatti is pacified. Hatti is ancient Turkey. Plundered is the Canaan with every evil. Carried off is Ashkelon, which is a single city that is just north of Gaza. Seized upon is Gezer, another city. Yanoam is made as that which does not exist. Evidently a city, but that one's the least known. Israel is laid waste. His seed is not. Huru is become a widow for Egypt. Some of these terms are very broad, like Canaan and Huru seem to be more broad regional terms, and people argue about what exactly how broad they are. All lands together they are pacified. Everyone who was restless, he has been bound by the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Then it gives all these titles, right? Ba-en-Re, Meri Ammon, the son of Re, Mernept, or Meren Ptah, Hotep here, Ma'at, given life like Re every day. The important things you want to know about him. So the big question is, what do you learn about Israel if this is the only thing you have? So, yeah? Is it all right?
I highlighted it, my next slide.
Oh, okay. Israel is laid waste. There you go. Right? So right in the middle, Israel is laid waste. His seed is not. Though you can read around it a little bit too. If I only put the one line up there, then you'd be hampered. Because part of understanding what this line means is seeing what it's embedded in. Yeah, go ahead.
It was conquered and pacified by Egypt.
Okay, so it appears to have been conquered. So you said conquered and pacified. Anybody want to take in a different direction? Go ahead.
I would say that like the physical area was laid waste, but the seed is not, like the people are still living. Like the people are still living on it. That's referring to like Israel as a people, but the first part is referring to Israel as like a location.
Okay. This is a possibility. Anybody, how do you know what seed is? Like I said, I'm always going to look for somebody new, but I'll come back to you if nobody else raises their hand. Seed, what else can it mean? Yeah, go ahead.
Like grain and basic agriculture.
Yeah, it could actually. In fact, I didn't give it to you, but last year I gave them this whole article by somebody about how somebody arguing that if you look at all the examples of this word in Egyptian royal annals, that he said it does mean grain. What were you going to say?
I'm just curious, but because it says Canaan, doesn't it clearly make a difference between Canaan and Israel? So Israel must be a people, so seed is not necessarily grain, but it must be some type of like future generation.
So this is, I don't know if everybody could hear. The question is, I mean, everybody gets their own line in a sense, and absolutely Israel has its own reference, and it's only for Israel that it says his seed is not. So for sure you've got to be right that the focus in that line is Israel's seed. It's not a sort of regional thing like everybody is involved. So it is a good argument to say that if there's a problem for Israel with its seed, then it's Israel in particular that's suffering this fate as opposed to the others. And in spite of what you guys can play out the argument in more than one direction. Scholars have made both arguments. That what one direction would be to say the term really refers to literal seed. It's often associated with actual grain, and it is referring to the particular situation of Israel. Maybe they're not a city, they're in the highlands perhaps. There's farming country, and so it's saying they're now going to be totally impoverished because all their farming has been wiped out. So I hope that's not for us. So, somebody probably went in the wrong door. So, but absolutely, whoever said that it looks like descendants and all that, that argument's really been made as well. And it's attractive partly because as you go through these categories, especially the set at the end, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, those are marked in Egyptian, but also in some other ancient writing systems. They would have kind of code markers that they would attach to the names for things, where they would give you a category so that as a scribe you sort of knew what kind of thing to expect. And in Egyptian, they would mark types of political entities differently. So if it was a city, then it would be marked as a city. And so Israel is marked by something like as a people. Do you have this somewhere?
I think I do.
Oh, good. There you go. The stela does not make clear what Israel refers to. Yeah. So, but what seems to be the case is that the definition as a people is not so much tied to a fixed city center, and that this is this extra designation that the scribes attached on. And so at least some people have wondered whether when you say his seed is not, you're talking about kind of kinship, tribal type organized people, and focus more on their inability to reproduce. But yes?
Wouldn't you compare the word Israel to the other 9 bows?
9 bows.
The 9 bows. So if Ashkelon or Canaan or
Here, let's,
Gezer-
Mari, go back to the other one. Thank you.
So if Canaan, Gezer, or Ashkelon, or Hati, or lands, then aren't they all equal? So
This is right, they aren't all equal. And so one of the things that would be interesting that I don't know enough about, I've not studied this text in depth, although it kind of comes up all the time, is that the types of categories in it are different. So and that's helpful in a way. So when you put Israel in the midst of this, you don't have to expect that they're going to be on the same plane as everything around them, because there's a certain variety. like Hatti is a major kingdom empire that rivaled Egypt based in ancient Turkey. It was just as big and powerful as Egypt, at least at that time. And it meant a very specific state, really almost an empire. Whereas like Tehenu, I always mix this up, but I think it's a sort of broader term for Syria that's not tied to a specific political entity. And the same is true for Huru, that again, it seems to be a broad description of Syria that's not tied to a specific political entity. So those are really different. Then Canaan is kind of a weird category because in Egyptian it seems to refer to all the lands that they controlled in Asia, sort of along the Mediterranean. And so it's a little unclear, depending on the context, whether they mean a political entity or just the region. But in a way, then, that brings the focus to the four names in the middle because, well, at least Ashkelon and Gezer we know are cities and sort of small political entities built around those. And Yanoam appears to be that too. So then when you put Israel in that company, it looks like in the middle of the text, like you have broad descriptions around it, and then in the middle of it, you put these very specific names that might refer to specific victories. Yeah, go ahead.
How did they exactly translate Israel from that Egyptian text? Like, what did they?
Yeah, this is a really good question. Like, how would they even know that it was Israel, if I hear you, right? My question to start, watch the clock. So I wanted to know what you could learn about Israel with only this as a guide. But in fact, the first question I had in my notes that I just blipped right past was, how do you know that the Israel name is correctly interpreted? And in fact, it's a little bit difficult. For one, again, this is off the top of my head, but my memory is that there's some, that in Egyptian they don't distinguish L and R, so that I'm pretty sure it's the L. They have no L exactly, or at least it's what's usually rendered as L, so that there's an R there again. The other elements would line up pretty exactly with the consonants that make up the rest of the Israel name. But, I mean, Egyptologists can fuss about how good the match is. It certainly is agreed that it's plausible. But if just you guys, right? So you haven't learned much. The class is just beginning. You're just in a general course. But you look at this stuff. How would you, what would be your first argument that it really was Israel? That it really was the Israel we're studying? Think about it. Yeah, what would you say?
Are there any later Egyptian texts that it's clear that it's Israel
Nope.
that matches?
Yeah, nothing else, which is too bad, huh? Yeah, it's a very rare word. It's the only time it occurs. Yeah, go ahead.
I think the comment about being a seed might be a giveaway in the sense that earlier you mentioned it was a really agricultural society.
Okay, so I mean, this fits again, but there's a lot of these people in the area are going to live similar lives. Go ahead, yeah?
I guess because Israel, like the country, is like in the same area as Egypt, right? So like,
Yeah. What were you going to say?
It's in the same area as all the other places that are mentioned.
Yeah, so I mean, I was kind of headed the way both you guys went, right? That for one, we know what Gezer was. We know what Ashkelon was for sure. Yanoam, we have a pretty good fix on. It's probably farther north. And so that's right. I mean, we know the date of the text. We know for sure they're talking about an area that does eventually come to include Israel. So if you're, no matter what the name is in Egyptian, it's not a known name from anywhere else. It's a unique name. So then the question is, why introduce this unique name that sounds exactly like Israel, that's in the company of other places that are in the right place to be Israel, and invent that it's somebody else, right, that's also unknown. So in fact, historians, just Egyptologists, do generally acknowledge that this is Israel. There's very little dispute. There is a little bit. There have been a couple of people a little bit on the fringes, but who have disputed even the reading of the name. But the best argument in favor of it being Israel is the location, is the association with these other places. And but keep in mind, this is how you handle evidence. It's not just a given that it is Israel. It does appear that it is. And it appears that it's in this company of these other cities from which it's distinguished by being a people instead of being a city or city land. So with the couple minutes that I've got left, I mean, the way I would tie all this up would be then to say that, so in this text, we see that there is a group called Israel. In the end of the 13th century, that somebody early on said could be defeated politically. So you could say, oh, well, it was destroyed. But of course, if it's going to keep existing and we're going to study it, it better not have been destroyed completely, right? So however you read this text, you might not want to assume that it means that Israel comes to an end. But remember that it's written by the Egyptians, and they just want to say that they smashed these people and they're not going to come back. But we never hear what the people of Israel had to say about it. So we shouldn't assume from the text that they're gone. But we can assume that they were organized as a political body that the people of Egypt could fight against and, in their mind, defeat under that name. So they're not just like a class of, they're not the poor, they're not the rich, they're not warriors, they're not shepherds. They're some kind of actual people whom Egypt can fight under that name. And they appear to be in the region that's shared by these other cities somewhere, which turns out to be in the hills. I mean, at least it makes sense between what Yanoam would be up in the north and Ashkelon and Gezer. It would probably occupy hills between those two that matches later Israel in rough terms. But the biggest thing that I want you to know, which I don't have time to talk about today, is that when archaeologists look at ancient Israel, there's this shift in population between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Again, a whole story to get into, but the Iron Age is associated with Israel. There's a whole boom of new population, new settlements, new villages, new building, people moving in, and archaeologists have said, look, here you go, this is Israel. What we have to do is explain this. This text is older, it appears, than that boom of new settlement. The reference to Israel in Meren Ptah in Egypt is older. So something is going on where Israel is already there when the Iron Age begins. So aside from what you learn about Israel being there and there's some kind of people and you can fight them, they're in this land. They're here in some sense too early for the archaeologists. And we'll come back to that. All right? See you next time.